Hello and welcome back to another super entertaining episode of What the Buddy and Kreese. We are your hosts. I'm Buddy,
and I'm Kreese.
Today we're going to let Kreese tell us some stories from the law enforcement world. So we're just going to jump right in. What you got for us, sir?
So very often, throughout the career, when you start into law enforcement, your trainers will tell you, and some of the senior officers, they will tell you that you're going to experience things that you never thought you would.
Right.
You're going to see things that you never thought you would, that are sometimes very bad.
Right.
But you're going to see things and experience things and hear things and have no idea what it is.
Right.
And what I'm getting at is I've had several senior officers who've had certain experiences. One with the agency I worked for, another was another good senior officer that I knew quite well,
right,
who worked for another community several miles away. And they shared that, yes, we have paranormal experiences as law enforcement,
right,
in a wide variety. Some officers will acknowledge it, others won't.
Right.
But one of the things that the officers will talk about themselves once, but then they won't really expand on it unless they're really hounded about it, is unidentified flying objects, UFOs.
Okay.
And I believe that the military or the government it's not UFO anymore, it's UFI or UF something.
Right, some kind of vowel.
It's not, UFO is considered old school.
Right.
But I am old school, so that's why I still utilize UFO as the acronym.
Right.
So I had just started in the mid-90s working as a police officer in a mining town here in the eastern part of the state. And the police chief at the time, he'd already been there well over 20 years in this small town. And you understand, this small town is 2,500 people max.
Right.
That are full-time residents in the wintertime with the winter visitors and tourists passing through on the highway.
Right.
Maybe at any one time we could technically have about 5,000 people in town.
Wow.
But 2,500 usually is what the max was, and I'm probably being very generous with that. Because it's an old mining town.
Yeah.
So a lot of the buildings were, dilapidated.
Dilapidated.
Thank you. Wow, is it getting late this evening?
Yeah. So this was not a mining town that was still mining.
Correct.
This was basically converted from a mining town to a municipality of sorts.
Correct. Now this town, the mine was still there. It was still technically active. It had some staff members there, but they weren't necessarily drilling or actively mining for any ore or anything of that nature.
Without giving too much away.
But this town has been around since the mid 1800s, very well, probably the early 1800s.
Okay.
And it has gone through many different mines within the city limits and within
mining
the area.
Companies. Sure.
Different mining companies over the years. The buildings being repurposed many times.
Right. Recycled community.
Correct. So, and for those of you that don't know, it does. The ores do produce a certain type of energy that can attract certain things, and that's another theory out there because we like theories here.
Right. Love theories.
So, fast forward or rewind, how you want to look at it.
Sure.
So the police chief was chief at the time. This was the mid 80s.
At the time of the incident, or when you're talking about now?
This incident that he's telling me about.
Okay.
So I started in mid 90s with him, and we ended up having a conversation.
Right.
And this conversation was just about sharing experiences and what to expect. Because I'm brand new, fresh out of the academy.
Okay.
And he was telling me, he goes, I had this experience one time.
All right.
And he goes, I usually don't tell the story, but you're new, and I think it's important that you know.
Right. And when an old timer tells you that, get ready because it's probably going to be good.
Probably going to be good. It's one of two things. It's probably either going to be, holy crap.
Yeah.
It's going to be, oh my gosh, that's completely inappropriate.
Right.
Or you're going to be basically silent.
Yeah.
They're going to tell you the story, and you're going to be like, okay, blown away. I have no words to share this.
Right.
So the chief proceeded to tell me, he goes, back, it was about 83, 84.
Okay.
It was, August.
All right.
Beginning of September.
It's late summer.
Late summer, but back then we didn't have the heat islands like we had then. So true. You could actually see fall starting to happen.
Right.
Even though it was late August and early September, but that's when they were really in this town. They start classifying. Okay, we're at fall. It's slowly going to start turning here.
Sure.
It's not full blown fall.
Right.
Don't get me wrong.
No.
But it's starting.
And it's not Midwest fall either.
Correct.
It's Arizona fall.
Yeah. So, and he said, the town's always had roughly 2,000, 2,500 people. It's pretty steady. It fluctuates, depending on economies and the weather and the time of season, etc.
Right.
But he went on to say, he in a small town like this, the chief covers day shift.
Okay.
Because the officers, they work the evenings.
Sure.
One, it's the perk of being the chief.
Right.
But guess what? You're not going to have in a small town. You don't have enough officers. So as chief, you have to respond to calls.
Okay.
Not like these big municipalities where the chief doesn't do anything but sit in city council meetings all day long.
Figurehead, yeah.
Figurehead and talks to the damn media.
Right.
So the chief went on to say, he goes, at the time, he goes, nothing ever happened back then. He goes, it was quiet. It was a quiet community.
Okay.
The mines had recently shut down. People were kind of reeling from that a little bit, but he goes, we didn't have a lot of the issues that we have now, like when I came on board. Now, when I came on board, there was a lot of drugs, a lot of drinking, a lot of domestic violence, which unfortunately is kind of expected.
Right.
When there is no economy, you have to drive
People
well over
upset,
an hour for any type of employment.
Right.
So you do have some social ills and social issues that have to be addressed, and criminal issues that have to be addressed.
Right.
But he goes, back then, he goes, in that time in the mid '80s, like that, it was very minimal. He goes, there'd be times that we would go days without a single call.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, that's
that's
great.
Yeah.
It makes it boring for the officer on duty,
sure.
but it's great that there's nothing going on.
Right.
Because honestly, nothing going on, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
For society.
For law enforcement.
For law enforcement, and the public itself. So he proceeded to say, he goes, it was about 6:45.
Okay.
On a Sunday morning. The evening officer, he was getting ready to check off at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Chief said, I always got up about 6:30, between 6:30 and 6:45, I'd call the station and say, hey, anything happening right now?
Right.
Then you almost always knew the answer was no.
Right. So,
and when you call in, he'd always talk to the officer on duty, because the officer would be in the office at that time.
Okay.
He wouldn't be out patrolling. It's early morning, nobody's out,
right.
Especially on a Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. And he'd check in and say, hey, what happened overnight? And he'd get a quick little briefing there, and he goes, okay, I'll be in the office at 8 like usual.
Right.
And he's like, okay, Chief, no problem. So Chief said he finished his coffee, finished his eggs and bacon, took his time, getting ready like he did every Sunday morning for the shift. And the Chief, he had his regular days off too, but he always took Sundays more because the officer, he had a couple of older officers that worked for him at the time, a couple of newer guys that would work the hot evening calls when they're busy.
The busy times.
Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Okay.
But the Sundays were usually pretty quiet, and Saturday evening was always one of the senior officers that would be his Monday basically.
Okay.
For that shift. So, and he's getting off Sunday morning at 8 a.m. So the Chief said he's sitting there taking his coffee, and he's polished he's putting his badge on, putting his uniform together, and as he's putting his pants on and buckling up his duty belt and his uniform, he turned his radio on and just to listen and see what's going on.
Right.
And over the radio is the dispatcher calls and says, "Hey, Chief, are you on the air yet?" And he said, "Yeah, go ahead." And the dispatcher said, "Hey, be advised that over at the campground, we got a report of an unknown disturbance going on."
Okay.
And Chief's like, "Okay." He told me first at the campground. So to kind of explain what this campground is. This campground was literally when you first came into town, and on the front end, the caretakers of this campground had 3 little cottages that they could rent out to travelers passing through.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't a KOA campground,
right?
If you know what those are. However, but it was similar to the situation of a KOA. So they had like 3 or 4 up front, and you pulled in the driveway, and the office is one of those up front where the property manager would stay also. And then you drive back in about 50 yards. It was a nice little wooded path. Back then it was, I've seen pictures from back in the mid 80s
Uh-huh.
when the creek was actually flowing year round.
Right.
Not late 90s now where it's dry as bone unless it rains. But the creek was flowing. It had beautiful blue, big, huge trees blooming. They were green, nice green grass along the creek. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
You drive in about 50 yards, and then you hit the individual campgrounds.
Okay.
And this isn't like back in motorhome. It's mid 80s.
Right.
How many
all tent camping?
A
mostly?
lot of tent camping.
Okay.
There were a few RV type stuff, but
okay.
but this time of year, there really wasn't that many people camping or staying in this campground.
Okay.
There were 2 or 3 tents.
All right.
And those were mostly, according to the chief, were drifters passing through.
Okay.
They were
coming
not
down from the high desert.
Yeah, and they were just hiking.
Okay.
They, that highway, we had a lot of hitchhikers.
All right.
Over the years, even in the late 90s, in mid to late 90s, we always had a bunch of hitchhikers coming through. So that was the type of situation that people at the time were staying there. There may have been, according to the chief, he goes, there's like 3 people tops staying at that property.
Oh, wow.
He goes, I don't even think the cottages up front were even rented that night.
Okay.
So the chief's like, okay, go ahead and send the officer down there. I'll if he needs me, he'll call me and I'll go over. And the chief even said, he told dispatch, he goes, oh, it's probably so-and-so, one of the local individuals who really likes to get intoxicated on Saturday nights.
Oh, okay.
And more than likely, he probably stumbled down there and he's probably sleeping. And those type of calls, which is common, get called in as an unknown problem. Well, it's basically somebody who shouldn't be there.
Right.
Passed out drunk.
Sure.
So the chief said, yeah. So dispatcher's like, okay. So he lets the officer know. The officer's like, okay, 10-4, I'll head that way. Now, this time it's 7:30 in the morning.
Okay.
30 minutes until the officer gets off duty.
Right.
So chief, not rushed, takes his time, continues to get dressed, finishes his coffee. Chief was a smoker. And Chief said, he said, I finished my last morning cigarette before I got in the car.
Right.
And he goes, as he was putting his boots on, and the chief wore cowboy boots, because, we're the desert southwest.
Yeah.
So he was putting his black cowboy boots on that he wore under his uniform pants. And at this point, dispatch, he hears on the radio, dispatch trying to do what we in the industry call code 20 checks. Basically checking on the officer to make sure they're all right.
Okay.
Now, to back up, the chief heard the officer check out.
Okay.
On scene, or he arrived and let dispatch know, and it was at 7:36 that morning.
Okay.
So roughly 6 minutes after the dispatch and chief talked.
Okay.
And then they notified the officer, which is, it's
less
a small
than
town.
10 minutes.
So 6 minutes to get there, less than, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't a hot call running lights and sirens too.
Okay.
So there's really no reason to race down there at that point.
Right.
So taking 6 minutes in a small town to get to when there's no traffic and nobody out, it's not uncommon.
Sunday
it's
morning,
fine.
right.
Yeah, it's not crazy.
Okay.
Crazy amount of time. So the chief's here's dispatch start doing the calls 10 minutes after.
Okay.
Which is common. You don't hear from an officer for 10 minutes on a scene or like on a traffic stop or call, then dispatch will start doing safety checks.
Right.
Call them code.
Make sure the officer.
Back in my day, we called them code 20 checks. I'm sure the agencies all call them different things nowadays.
Right.
No answer. Initially, dispatch did a second one, no answer.
Okay.
So then dispatch stopped calling. Now that's not uncommon for the officers
to be busy
and not able to tell their rate dispatch I'm okay, because maybe they're getting witness statements, maybe they're dealing with a bad guy right then and there, and it'd be a safety issue to answer your radio there instead of dealing with that situation at that moment.
Right.
So it's not uncommon. So usually if you didn't get an answer, dispatch would wait another 5, maybe as much as 10 minutes again before doing another
in between
and doing another call. Okay. Now the chief, at this point, it's 7:46.
All right.
She does a couple calls.
We're now 10 minutes into after he made his initial contact.
7:48, still no answer. So dispatch stops waiting. So chief's like, yeah, you know what? That's a route to the station. I kind of have to go that way. He goes, I'll just take a little loop and I'll just swing by and just double check. But he's not worried about it at this point.
Okay.
So the chief goes down the outer road of the town, because there was a little circle road, I called it.
Right. Like a little bypass.
Yeah, a little bypass, but it just went around the edge of the town. And so he's driving down there, and he looks over that way, over the trees and stuff. Doesn't think when you're down in that road, there's lots of trees in that area also, and you always look around to see if there's anybody out there, what's going on, any animals. It's common to see deer every now and then.
Right. Maybe Bigfoot?
I think we're a little too low for Bigfoot.
Okay,
it could
possibly.
Be. It could be.
Yeah.
So, so the chief's cruising around, and then at this point, the chief gets to the front of the campground on the highway, and there's a truck driving by, a pickup truck, not an 18-wheeler, a pickup truck driving by.
All right.
Speed limit slow on the main highway through the middle of town because it's going through the middle of town.
Sure.
So he's got his turn signal. He's waiting in dispatch. At this point, it's now 7:53. So dispatch is starting to do more code 20s. The officer's not responding.
Okay.
And the chief's like, "Hey, dispatch, be advised, I'm pulling into here right now.
Right.
I'll advise. I'll check on the officer. I'm pulling in." So now the chief's kind of like, maybe he didn't turn his portable on.
Okay.
Then turned it up because when we
battery could have gone dead.
Correct.
Potentially.
So when we were in the station doing paperwork or just checking in or doing whatever at the station, we turned our portable radios off because if we had them on in the if we had them on in the station by the dispatch center, we had the feedback, especially if another officer from the outside that was on patrol was trying to call in, and then we'd have that feedback. So it was mandatory, like you just did it.
Yeah.
So, and back then, they carried what we called the bricks, the old Motorola radios that had one channel turn and a volume turn and on-off button. Okay. And they were literally the size of a brick. They were huge.
And as heavy as a brick.
Correct. So you remember the original cell phones that came out?
Right.
We used to call those the brick phones. Yeah. So the portable radios actually were heavier and more square. Right. Not as long, but they were heavier and more square. Right. Of a size. So they were hefty. Yeah.
With lots of sharp edges that would gouge into your side when you're sitting in your car.
Correct.
And all that kind of crap.
Digging a uniform, to wear a hole in uniform, and into your duty belt. Yeah, exactly. Sure. So the chief pulls in, nothing crazy. He doesn't see the manager, and obviously it's Sunday morning. Manager probably went to sleep after talking to the officer. Right. So he proceeds to pull back in that little camp area there, the 50 yards down there, and he sees the officer standing next to his patrol car. Okay. Looking up.
Oh boy.
And the chief's like, what the heck is going on here? Right. So the chief pulls up partially to the left of the other officer's car. Okay. Gets out, opens the door, and calls the officer by his first name and go, "Hey, what are you doing? Hey, are you okay? What's going on?" The officer doesn't say anything. Oh. Chief asks him 3 times, "Hey, are you okay?" Right. The chief then leaves his patrol. He's got his car door open, standing up, but he walks around from his car, goes over to the officer, grabs the officer by the arm and shakes him and goes, "Are you all right?" Right. And he goes, "Chief, you need to look up." Oh. And the chief's like, "What?" And the chief turned, looked up. Now at this point, they're facing south. Okay. But there's all these huge trees here. Now the trees aren't on top of each other, so you can see, if you look up, you see the trees, but you also see
you see clear. Okay.
And the chief told me, he goes, in all his years, and even up to this day that he's telling me here in the mid-90s when I started, when he's telling me the story, that when he looked up, he had never seen anything like this before. Okay. But he goes, it's a textbook, gray, round cylinder object, floating silently with multicolored flashing lights.
Wow.
And it was hovering within the trees, not necessarily above the trees at this point, but within in the middle of the trees.
Kind of nestled in the trees.
Yeah. Huh. And he's looking at it, and the officer's like, "I don't know what to do, Chief." The chief's like, "Neither do I. We're just going to stand here." Right. And they watched that thing. They watched that thing for 15 minutes. Wow. That was after the chief got there. Now, remember, the officer had already been
So the officer's been there for a while.
He'd already been there almost 15 minutes prior. Okay.
Right.
And they just stood there and stared at it, and they never got probed.
Thankfully.
They never, and this is how they know, because their watches never stop working. Okay. Like sometimes you hear those stories. Yeah. Their cars, they never lost power. Okay. The one thing that was odd,
besides looking at the object in the sky,
this just kind of verifies some of this, the descriptions you get, is that the officer And the chief never heard dispatch calling additional code 20s on them after the chief checked out on scene.
Okay. Wow.
So at this point, the dispatcher had already started calling the sheriff's office, asking them to send. Now, the sheriff's office was well over an hour away, the nearest deputy.
Oh, wow.
Because that's how far out this little community was. Dispatch was calling the sheriff's office saying, my officer and my chief are out on a disturbance. I have had 0 radio contact with them for 30 minutes. Can you please start deputies this way to go check on them?
Right.
At this point, now it's a long time with no communication.
Right.
Granted, technically 15 minutes with the chief, but 30 minutes with the other officer.
Sure.
And now we're approaching another 15 minutes, equaling 30 minutes with no contact.
Yeah.
So
from start of incident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she was on the phone to the sheriff's office saying, I need you, please, we need mutual aid, we need backup. Please send deputies to go check. They're not responding.
Right.
I'm concerned. And at this point, it's a small town.
Yeah.
So in a small town, the 5 officers he had on his department at that time, the other ones were all on days off.
Right.
So they're not there.
Right.
They're not in town. They went to the big city.
Right.
You know, because there's nothing in town.
Right.
So they went to the big city. So it's just those two. So
just those two guys.
Dispatch was panicked at this point, according to the chief, which makes sense.
Sure.
Makes a lot of sense. So the chief said that, yeah, they stood there, and then after that 15 minutes, and he goes, it felt like 5 hours we were staring at it.
Wow.
And I'm like, that makes sense.
Sure.
And he said it just was gone that fast.
Wow.
It zipped straight up in the air that fast.
Right. Did he mention if there was any kind of trigger?
Nothing.
As to why it took off?
It just took off.
Decided to leave.
Yep.
Wow.
It just took
crazy.
off. And him and the other officers, they just, when that happened, they took a step back, like, oh, what the? Because it didn't blow wind. You know, like when an airplane takes off,
sure.
you have the
afterburner.
thank you, and you have the engine exhaust and everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Nothing. It was calm. It wasn't even windy.
Wow.
It didn't even disturb the trees.
Holy smokes.
When it took off.
Huh.
So the chief and the officer were like, Chief, how do I write this up? And the chief said, unfounded. Technically it was.
Sure.
Because what they were there for,
that wasn't it. Yeah. Wow.
So to this day,
interesting.
Well, the last time I talked to him, and it's been years, I ain't gonna lie, it's been decades since I talked to the old chief. He, at that time, he never had another experience with a UFO. That was his one and only experience with the UFO. The other officer, same thing with him. That officer was long gone before I even started working for the agency. But he said that him and the other officer never talked about it.
Right.
They did share with the dispatcher, because after it left, they got on the radio and said, we're okay, we're going to be clear of the scene, headed back to the station. And the dispatcher got on the radio and said, are you guys okay? You guys weren't answering. And the chief's like, oh, we'll talk to you when we get back to the station. She goes, do you want me to cancel the deputies? And he's like, deputies?
Oh.
Yeah, we don't need backup.
Right.
They had no idea. They thought time was, while it felt like 5 hours, they really thought it was just a couple minutes.
Oh, wow.
They didn't realize it was over 30 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, so they went back to the station. They walked in. They immediately went and saw the dispatcher, because she obviously was disturbed and concerned because the officers were missing.
Irritated.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So they walked in. The dispatcher immediately went over and yelled at them, not screaming, hey, top of the line, what the hell are you doing? But basically said, hey, you guys need to answer me so I know you're okay. You made me worry.
Right.
What the heck was going on out there? And so the chief and the other officer, they told their story to the dispatcher.
Right.
And they said the dispatcher's like, you guys were full of it. You guys were just down there eating breakfast burritos, weren't you?
Right.
And the chief's like, normally we would be doing that on a Sunday morning, because I do tend to bring in breakfast for the officer who's going home, and I usually bring dispatcher, but I didn't get a chance because I went over there to go see because the officer wasn't
ahead
responding.
of time. Yeah.
So they shared the story with the dispatcher, and the dispatcher's like, believed him but didn't believe him type thing.
Right.
So they just never really talked about it after that.
She believed because he's the boss,
exactly.
but didn't believe because she thought he might have been full of
Exactly.
Full of beans.
Exactly, because jokesters.
Right. Yeah.
So they went on. The other officer who first responded there, he worked several more years for the agency before he ultimately left the agency and went to out of state to go be a police officer somewhere else.
Okay.
The chief stayed on another. Let's see, when I was there, mid-90s. He stayed on another 15 years.
Wow.
After this incident.
Yeah.
And retired with us. When I was there, he retired.
Right.
So it's interesting story. Kept an eye out. Now, did I see anything? Don't think I wasn't looking every night on the graveyard.
For sure.
So I happened to be on duty the night of the Phoenix Lights.
Oh, okay.
Which we'll go into another thing now.
Yeah, that's a whole nother episode.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm gonna end that episode right now. Did I see anything? No.
No.
I was too far east. Couldn't see Phoenix, couldn't see nothing. It was so far east.
Right.
There's mountains and everything. But I was just like, I was on duty that night. Oh my goodness. And how did I miss that? Well, I missed it because I wasn't anywhere near.
You were outside of the realm.
I was 90 to 100 miles east. So I was a long ways away. So
sure.
So he was So
good stuff.
You never know. Yeah, you never know what the old timers what they're going to share with you.
That's right. Always listen when they start to talk, just in case.
Yeah. Now they may be full of it, but you never know.
That's
telling
true.
you the truth.
That's true. All right. Well, that's going to end this one this week, and stay tuned for some more stories and things in the coming weeks. You can drop us a line at wtbnk@gmail.com if you'd like to share your stories with us, experiences, anything you might want us to cover on an episode. And we're also on all the social media platforms, your Twitter and your Instagram and your Facebook at @WTBNK. And like I said, just keep us in your thoughts and email us, and we'll see what we can do in the future.